Gemini said, so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 8:30 p.m. on August 20th, 2010, a 76-year-old man named John walked through the streets of New Taipei City, which is a major city in northern Taiwan. John was on the end of an evening walk, and he was making his way back towards his daughter's apartment where he was also staying. And as John neared the apartment, he happened to notice there was a street lamp right outside with this big poster attached to it he hadn't seen before. And as he got closer, he saw there was also this picture of this middle-aged woman whose name was Chun Yan Kue. And apparently she was missing. And not only that, she also lived in the same building that his daughter lived in, except Chun was actually a dementia patient and she was staying on the 5th floor of this apartment building complex, where there was this memory care facility, and that's where she was being taken care of. And about a week earlier, she had gone out for an evening walk. This is what it said on the poster, and just not returned. And so, since the week before, police had been out looking for her, and her family and friends, they were putting these posters up. And it was clear, it was clear. Nobody had found her yet. Now, Zhang had never met this woman, but he sort of felt bad for her. And so he found himself staring at this picture and trying to memorize her face, in the off chance that he just saw her somewhere, could report her to the authorities and hopefully get her rescued. And so, after staring at the picture for a little bit longer and sort of feeling bad for this woman, Zhang turned and just continued inside the apartment building. And once he was in the apartment building, he made his way over to the elevator. He hit the up button and he waited. And then, a moment later, there was a ding and the doors opened up. He stepped onto the elevator, he pressed the button, the doors closed. And then Zhang waited as he headed up to his daughter's apartment on the 7th floor. But as he was going up, he noticed he had accidentally hit the 6th floor, not the 7th floor. And right at that moment, he saw that he was reaching the 6th floor, and so the elevator car was slowing down. And so he just was like, oh, whoops, and he hit floor 7. But by the time he hit floor 7, the car had come to a stop on floor 6, and the doors were opening, like it would need to reset. Doors open on 6, they close, and then he'd go to 7. Like, this is no big deal. And so Zhang is just waiting, for these doors to open, shut, and go up one more floor. However, when the doors opened on floor 6, Zhang is looking straight out, and he could not believe what he saw, and he just began to scream. Around the same time this was happening, Zhang's daughter was finishing up her shift at work when she got a phone call, and she saw it was coming from her dad. And he rarely called her when she was at work, so this was sort of confusing and surprising. And so, right away, she picked it up and she answered, and immediately she hears her dad screaming incoherently. He's obviously terrified, and all Zhang's daughter can hear is that her dad is saying he's trapped. He's trapped in an elevator and he doesn't know what to do. And so, Zhang's daughter is getting scared just based on what her dad sounds like. She doesn't really know what's going on, but she told her dad, like, okay, I'll call the building. We'll get you some help, like stay calm, you're gonna be okay. But her dad just continued rambling, and he was totally incoherent. And eventually, Zhang's daughter just said, okay, Dad, like, just hang tight. I'm gonna get you some help. And then she hung up. And then she immediately called her apartment building's administration and emergency services line and told them, hey, I think my dad is stuck on one of your elevator cars. He's really upset. Can you please help him? And after getting the emergency services to, get spun up into action to go save her dad, Zhang's daughter left work, hopped in her car, and began rushing home. It would take Zhang's daughter about 40 minutes to get back to her apartment, and by the time she got there, she fully expected her dad would be safely out of the elevator. I mean, he was obviously very upset, but she had called the building. They were on it. They were going to get him out. But when she went inside the lobby of the apartment building, she saw a crowd of police officers just standing there. She didn't see her dad anywhere. And before she could even ask any questions, she noticed one of the officers was on the phone and clearly, just based on what was being said by this officer. He was talking to her father like he was talking to somebody who was hysterical, and this officer was doing his best to try to calm him down and sort of talk him through what was happening. And so Jong's daughter, immediately walks up to this officer and says, "Hey, I'm his daughter Earl. The guy who's stuck in the elevator, I'm his daughter. What's going on? I would have figured he'd be out by now. What's happened?" At this point, one of the officers confirms that, this really is this man's daughter, and he pulls her aside and he explains to her that, yes, your dad is still in the elevator because we can't get him out. The reality is, this is not a normal situation. He's trapped in there, and really the only way for him to get out is for him to do something really specific. Us in the building staff, we can't do anything. He has to do this one really specific thing. And right now, he's refusing to do it. He's too panicked, he's too scared, we're trying to calm him down, but it's not working yet. And so, Jong's daughter asked this officer, "Can you please explain to me what you're talking about? What is this specific thing you want him to do? I don't get." And at that point, the officer kind of composed himself and explained to the daughter, what was really going on inside of that elevator car. And after Jong's daughter heard it, she was horrified. And she immediately understood why her dad was so upset and unwilling to do this one particular thing that would save him, but would be pretty awful. She got it. But she knew she would have to hop on the phone and convince her dad that he had to do it. There was no other way. And so, she walked over to the officer who was on the phone with her dad. She took the phone, and she began talking her dad through, what he really needed to do here. She basically gave him a pep talk and said, "Dad, for me, you gotta find the strength and do this thing and get out of there." And sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, the elevator doors in the lobby chimed and opened up, and Jong came stumbling out. He looked horrible disheveled, but he was okay. And right away, police officers rushed towards him. But they bypassed him and went into the elevator, and immediately surrounded something in the elevator car. It would turn out that missing woman Chun Yan-kue, the woman who was on that poster that Jong saw before he walked into the apartment building, well, she really had gone missing a week earlier on her evening walk. But everybody thought she got lost while she was on that walk because she was a dementia patient, and so, she had memory issues. But the reality was, she actually did come back to her apartment. However, when she got on the elevator, she actually made the same mistake that Jong did. Now, she was not trying to get to the 7th floor. She was trying to get to the 5th floor, but she accidentally pressed the 6th floor. So, up she goes, she gets to the 6th floor, the doors open up, she steps off the elevator car, and she's immediately completely confused. And for what it's worth, it didn't matter that she had dementia. Anybody who got off on the 6th floor would likely be confused if you had never been to this building before, because the 6th floor was actually a private residence. And the person who lived on that floor was so worried about people breaking into their private residence that they had installed a metal gate in front of the elevator doors. And so, unless you had the key to get through this gate, when you got off on the 6th floor, you basically would step onto a little platform that basically is the hallway leading into the 6th floor, and then you'd be hit with the gate. And so, that's exactly what happened to Chun. She got off on the 6th floor, maybe thinking this is the 5th floor. She stepped onto that, little narrow strip that you could actually stand on the 6th floor before you reach the gate. And then, as she was trying to figure out, where am I? This isn't the 5th floor. This doesn't make any sense. There's a gate in front of me, the doors to the elevator closed, and she had no way to open them up again because the buttons to access the elevator were beyond the gate. And so, suddenly, Chun is standing in this narrow space, the doors have closed behind her, and she can't do anything. She's trapped between the gate and the elevator doors, and even though people are using this elevator right behind her, the only person who would come to the 6th floor is the owner of that residence, and they were on vacation. And so, for days and days, Chun is just trapped, basically in between the gate and the elevator, with no one having any idea she was there. She's calling out. She's doing everything she can to get somebody's attention, but nobody can hear her. And after 5 days of this, when the owner of this residence didn't come home, cause they were on vacation, she eventually died. Cause she didn't have food or water or anything. She was just standing there for 5 days. And so, she dies. And then, a couple of days later, Jong accidentally rides to the 6th floor. He's like, oh shoot, I need to go to 7. He hits 7, but the doors open on 6. And when they do, Chun's body, which had been basically frozen in the standing position, fell backwards onto him, pinned him to the ground. He starts screaming and freaking out. He gets out from underneath her, but her body, which was in rigor mortis at this point, is stiff point. And she was lying like a board on the ground with her feet jutting out onto the 6th floor and her upper half inside of the elevator. And so, she was blocking the doors from closing. And so, Jong is freaking out. He's calling his daughter. He can't believe this. There's this dead person in here. And eventually, police get involved and they tell Jong, you just gotta move the body so the doors will close. But again, her body is heavy and it's stiff, and she's obviously deceased. She's starting to decompose, and Jong basically couldn't handle it. And he was unwilling to move her body until his daughter hopped on the phone and said, you gotta do it, at which point he managed to lift her up, get her out of the way, and kind of push her off to the side of the elevator car. He rode down to the bottom, at which point the police came and unhandled the situation. Now, the owner of the 6th floor residence was not held criminally responsible, despite putting that gate up that created this trap that killed Chun. However, despite that, he would end up paying Chun's family about $97,000 equivalent just to compensate for her death. On the morning of August 18th, 2018, a 41-year-old man named Vladimir Kostenko stepped out of a taxi onto a desolate road in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, miles and miles from civilization. All he had with him were his cell phone, a solar-powered charger for his phone, and a backpack that contained some clothes and 5 pounds of oatmeal. Vladimir bent down and leaned into the taxi to pay the taxi driver, and as he was doing that, the driver looked up at him and just said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And Vladimir just smiled and nodded and said, "Yep, I'm gonna be just fine. Don't worry about me." Now, the taxi driver did not really buy this and just looked at Vladimir like he was completely insane. But Vladimir wasn't shocked. I mean, this is kind of how everybody reacted to him when he told them about this trip he was doing into the wilderness. You know, when he had brought it up to his family the first time, they and all of their family friends had basically rallied together to try to stop Vladimir from going on this trip. It was way too dangerous. But Vladimir said, "Guys, I'm going, like, you can't stop me. I'm doing this, it's important to me." And at that point, when, the family and friends knew they couldn't change his mind, they shifted and said, "Well, at least, bring a gun or bear spray or something to protect yourself." But Vladimir also refused that too. He said, "No, I don't need any of that because the only thing I need is God. God is going to protect me." So Vladimir was extremely religious. He actually had left his home country, Russia, when he was in his early 22nd because he was being persecuted for his Christian beliefs, and so now, in the United States, he lived out in Washington State and basically lived his life like a monk. I mean, he spent the majority of his time, basically praying and meditating and reading religious books. And he would often go on these multi-day-long fasts. He did work part-time as a mechanic, but he rarely charged his clients when he did work. And then even when he did charge them, he was working so few hours that the money he was making was totally unsubstantiable. But again, the way Vladimir looked at this is he didn't need money because ultimately God would take care of him. But despite all of his fasting and his praying and, his generosity, lately Vladimir had been feeling really lost. Like he did feel deeply spiritual, but at the same time, he didn't really feel fulfilled. Like he felt like he was missing purpose in his life, and it was really starting to bother him. And so, it was around this time that Vladimir decided to go on this big trip. One of Vladimir's family friends was this guy named Dmitry Kudrin, and he owned this small cabin way out in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Now, Dmitry didn't use this cabin very much, but he kept it in great shape. It was fully furnished, there was a wood-burning stove inside, and the pantry was stocked with a 3-year supply of food. And so, at some point when Vladimir and Dmitri were talking, and Vladimir talked about feeling sort of lost and wanting to reconnect with his spirituality and find his purpose in life, well, at some point, Dmitri said, "Well, hey, if you want himself, you can go use my cabin and sort of disconnect from society and go retreat out there and sort of focus on yourself and sort of get right with the world. You know, you're welcome to go out there anytime you want. You can stay out there as long as you want, and for free, no problem." And Vladimir had happily accepted. And now here he was, standing on this desolate road in the Alaskan wilderness, watching as the taxi driver drove away. Except he wasn't even close to the cabin. I mean, he was in the middle of nowhere already, but he still had to go 14 more miles with no trail to make his way to this cabin. But Vladimir was so excited. He really felt like this was the thing he needed to figure out his purpose in life. And so, he put his backpack on, took a deep breath, and began to hike. 3 months later, on November 3rd of 2018, Dmitri, Vladimir's friend who owned this cabin, found himself in his plane flying over the area roughly where his cabin was. And Dmitri was feeling very concerned. So, obviously, Dmitri suggested Vladimir go out and use this cabin, and so he was totally open to the idea of it. But Dmitri had also told Vladimir that when he went out there, he really ought to bring a gun with him, or if nothing else, at least some bear spray or something to protect himself, because this is truly the wild. You are not the top of the food chain anymore, and you want to be able to protect yourself. But Vladimir had said no. He would not be going with any sort of weaponry. That, God was going to look after him and he'd be fine. And Dmitri's like, that's a bad plan. But he just could not convince Vladimir to change his mind. And so, ultimately, Dmitri sort of regretted even suggesting this idea because he didn't expect Vladimir to go unarmed. But he felt like, you know what? It's already in motion. And so he told Vladimir, okay, fine, do your thing. But when you're out there, I need you to communicate with me regularly so I know you're okay. And Vladimir promised he would. And at first, that is exactly what happened. Vladimir, made the 14-mile hike from where he was dropped by the taxi. He got to the cabin, he got all set up, and then just about every other day or every few days, he would hike up this nearby mountain where there was cell phone service, and he would update Dmitri. He would tell him that things were going great. He was spending lots of time meditating and praying, and, he was foraging for berries. And there was this pesky squirrel that kept coming in and stealing his food, so he was trying to figure out what to do with the squirrel. But clearly, things were going fine and Vladimir appeared to be safe. However, after 6 weeks of Vladimir being at this cabin, those pretty regular updates just abruptly stopped. Now, at first, Dmitri kind of chalked it up as like, well, I've been talking to him for weeks. There didn't appear to be any, burgeoning crisis or anything going on in his life that might warrant some concern. He's a capable guy. Maybe 'cause it's the Alaskan winter, and Alaskan winters are notoriously dark, there's not a lot of sunlight. Maybe his solar-powered charger isn't working. He can't get enough sunlight so he can't charge his phone. And so maybe that's what it is. He just can't contact me 'cause his phone doesn't turn on. Basically, Dmitri was coming up with these sort of rationales for why he wasn't hearing from his friend. But as the days went on and Dmitri still didn't hear from Vladimir, he couldn't help but start to feel like something's wrong here. And so finally in early November, when Dmitri still had not heard from Vladimir, it's been about a month since those text messages stopped, Dmitri decided to get into his plane and fly out over the area where this cabin was and literally look down and see if his friend was down there in the cabin. Also, this gave Dmitri the opportunity to put some supplies on the plane in these big buckets that he could literally throw out down to Vladimir to also restock him. So, Dmitri is now in his plane and he's circling around the area where his cabin is. But this cabin is really small, and it's sort of in this big sea of trees. I mean, there's nothing else for miles. And so it's pretty difficult with the naked eye to actually look out and see his own cabin. But Dmitri had this camera on the underside of his plane that he could maneuver and look all around. And he had this screen that he could see from the cockpit. It was basically an enhanced view of the ground down below. It was a lot easier to see, for example, his cabin. And so, as he was circling, he's moving the camera around, and then, bam, he sees right in the middle of the screen is his cabin. And there doesn't appear to be anything wrong with the cabin. You know, it all looks good. There's smoke coming up out of the chimney. And as he's circling, he's thinking, okay, Vladimir clearly is going to hear me. He's going to come outside, and I'll see that he's okay. And sure enough, as he's circling around, Dmitri sees on his screen that the front door of the cabin opens, and his friend Vladimir walks right outside onto the porch. He puts his hands on his hips and he looks up and he waves at Dmitri. And there's this moment of clear recognition. Like, obviously, Vladimir knows this is Dmitri coming to check on him. And like, Vladimir's down there kind of gesticulating that, hey, everything's fine. I'm good, Sorry about the phone thing, or, Dmitri didn't know what he was doing. But it just sort of seemed like, okay, there's recognition here that it's been a month, but everything is fine. And so, Dmitri got down nice and low and continued to circle. And on one of his passes over the cabin, he pulled a lever, dropped the supplies, those buckets of supplies, they landed down below. And then as Dmitri continued to circle, he watched on the camera as Vladimir walked up and put his hands on the supplies and waved again to Dmitri, sort of signaling, thank you for the supplies. And at that point, Dmitri's thinking, okay, Vladimir's just fine. Everything's good. I can go home. And so, that's what he did. Now, he would have landed and gone and seen Vladimir up close, but, there wasn't anywhere to land anywhere nearby. Like, this was the closest he could get to Vladimir. And so he decided this was enough. So, Dmitri, he turned around and he headed home. But about 2 months later, on December 23rd, Dmitri was once again in his plane, flying over the area where his cabin was, because over these last 2 months, he continued not to get any text messages or any communication from Vladimir, which, that was bad. He sort of expected that, given that Dmitri flew out there before and they clearly recognized, like, hey, are you good, dude? There was sort of a moment of recognition that Dmitri's checking in on Vladimir because of the silence. That's what Dmitri's thinking. Maybe that would inspire Vladimir to find a way to send out communications now. Like, let Dmitri know he's okay, but he hadn't for 2 months. And so, Dmitri's thinking, okay, that's bad. Also, it's now December, and the winter in Alaska is full bore. I mean, tons of snow on the ground, it's frigid temperatures, it is truly brutal winter conditions. And then, lastly, there had also just been this major earthquake in the area where Dmitri's cabin was. And so all those things combined made Dmitri think, okay, I better get out there and just check on Vladimir again. And so, once again, Dmitri is circling low over the area where his cabin is. He's got his camera aimed towards the ground and he's moving it around as he's circling, and eventually, he finds his cabin. And his cabin is clearly in one piece, so the earthquake did not destroy his cabin. But there's no sign of Vladimir anywhere. But then again, this is just the first second he's seen the cabin. He's only been in the area for a couple of minutes now. Maybe Vladimir has not heard the plane yet. And so, Dmitri's not lost hope, and he continues to circle. And as he's circling, he drops these supply buckets that land right out in front of the cabin. And at this point, Dmitri's thinking, okay, that's pretty noisy, having these supply buckets smash into the ground outside. Certainly now Vladimir is going to come outside to see what's going on. I mean, there's not much else happening. This clearly is something that would draw his attention. But no, nobody comes out of the cabin. And so at this point, Dmitri gets as low as he possibly can, and he's got his camera aimed right at the cabin. And as he's doing another pass, he realizes something. There's no smoke coming out of the chimney. In fact, the top of the chimney is covered with snow, which means clearly no fire has been lit, at least not recently. And so, Dimitri starts to panic, like if anybody was in that cabin right now without a fire lit, it would be so cold. They would likely freeze to death really quickly. Like, this is a crisis. What's going on with Vladimir? But Dimitri couldn't land anywhere nearby. Like, there was no way for him to really get down to this cabin. And so, he had to fly all the way to the nearest airport, and then once he touched down, he immediately contacted Alaska State Troopers to report his friend missing, cause that was the only thing he could think to do. However, after Dimitri made this report, the state troopers didn't launch some huge search for Vladimir, and that's in part because they weren't actually sure he was missing. They understood that Dimitri, after flying out over the area, had seen snow on the chimney cap, and it's really cold out. Like, nobody could survive without a fire. And also, he flew over the area, dropped supplies, and Vladimir didn't come out of the cabin. How could he not hear that stuff? They understood that, but they're also thinking, it's possible Vladimir just might not have been in the area. Maybe he was out hunting or, foraging for food or whatever he was doing, and maybe he just wasn't in the area. And that's why it gave you the impression that he was missing. And so, that was one part of it. And the other part is, the weather was atrocious in this part of the world, and so just sending out a search party into the terrible weather, out into the wilderness, was really risky. And so, the troopers thought it just wasn't worth doing this big search. And so, instead of launching a big search, the troopers told Dimitri that what they were going to do instead is just comb through airline records, local airline records, to see if maybe a Vladimir Kostenko had, taken off and flown out of the area. Maybe he didn't tell Dimitri, and he just left. Maybe that's why he's not there. And this really frustrated Dimitri and the rest of Vladimir's family, because they're all looking at this as a true emergency. And they're thinking there's no way he just hopped on a plane and flew out of here without telling anyone. And so, finally, 3 days after filing this missing person report, Dimitri said, "Enough is enough is enough. I'm gonna just take it into my own hands and go out there myself and see what's going on with Vladimir." So, he chartered a private helicopter and he flew out to the cabin. And when he got there, he gets off the helicopter and he just scans the property. And he sees, this little cabin. And there's, firewood outside stacked up with snow all over it. There's loads of snow on the cabin. And there's snow kind of drifted up on the front door, making it seem like nobody's come in or out of this cabin for some time. And, Dimitri, he's looking around for Vladimir. But there's no sign of life anywhere. Dimitri calls out for Vladimir, but there's no response. And so, with some level of trepidation, Dimitri begins walking up towards his cabin. And when he gets close enough to the front door, he notices something weird. He sees that the front door of this cabin has clearly been boarded up from the outside. There's this big piece of metal that's been placed, basically blocking the door so nobody could go inside of it. And so, Dimitri's thinking, why would you do this unless you were leaving the cabin? But why would Vladimir leave the cabin? Where is he? I don't understand what's going on here. And so, Dimitri goes up to this piece of metal and pries it off the front door, and then he swings open the front door and he looks inside. And everything is pristine. Vladimir is not inside, but the cabin looks immaculate. There's still firewood, there's still food, there's no sign of chaos, no sign of any struggle whatsoever. Everything looks exactly like it should exactly. And so, Dimitri, he began walking around inside of this cabin, looking for any clue as to what happened to Vladimir. But there was nothing until he got to the firewood. He noticed that, clearly, Vladimir had been labeling his firewood. There was one piece of firewood in particular where the writing was very clear, and what it said was, "Frankincense aroma, do not burn." And so, Dimitri is looking at this piece of wood, that's been labeled as something that he shouldn't be burning. And he's looking at other pieces of wood that also have some level of labeling on them, and he's thinking, what does that mean? I don't understand that at all. But that was it. There were no other clues about where Vladimir had gone, and even the labeling of the wood, like that, didn't give him anything. And so, The impression that Dmitri got after seeing this firsthand was that at some point, Vladimir, for reasons completely unknown, just decided to board up the cabin and disappear into the Alaskan wilderness with basically no protection. No clear sign he even brought food with him. He just got up and left. Friends and family, and even some authorities, believe there is a chance he could still be out there somewhere. In fact, at one point, authorities thought they had found Vladimir in Hawaii. It turned out not to be him. And then again, they thought they found him in Oregon. It turned out not to be him as well. But the case is still open, and authorities think, at least some do, that he might be alive somewhere, but nobody knows where. And so, at this point, all the family has to go off of is the final image of Vladimir, which was taken from inside of Dmitri's plane when he did that first flyover, and he saw Vladimir come out on the porch. That is the final image of Vladimir that we know of. We don't know what happened after this image. All we know is, at some point, he began labeling his firewood, writing down which aroma the wood makes, and then he boarded his place up and he left. But where he went next is still a mystery. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen's Presence, Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at Tapped. www.google.com search Book Ballen Studios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are going to sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. At 7:00 p.m. on October 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Volantch flew his small plane over a body of water just south of Australia called the Bass Strait. He'd just taken off from Melbourne, Australia, and his flight plan was to go 60 miles south to an island called King Island. And he was really excited about this flight, not so much about where he was going, but because this represented the first time he'd actually be flying by himself at night. So, Frederick had always dreamed of becoming a pilot, but the journey to actually becoming one had been really difficult. He had applied twice, actually, to the Royal Australian Air Force, but unfortunately, he could not meet their requirements. And then, also, he had tried to become a commercial airline pilot, but he had failed their tests. But luckily for Frederick, his father had a ton of money, and he ultimately swooped in and funded Frederick to take some private lessons, and through that, he was able to ultimately pass the tests and get his pilot's license. And so, as Frederick coasted along, looking down below at the lights of Melbourne disappearing behind him, he felt like he was on top of the world. He was doing the one thing he had always dreamed of, and he was so happy, and it was so cool to be doing it at night by himself. So, he was just looking out at the sights and looking ahead at the Bass Strait, which is this huge, dark expanse of water. And it was like everything was right in the world. He was doing exactly what he wanted to do. However, only a few minutes into this flight at 7:06 p.m., something strange happened. As Frederick was flying along, he suddenly became aware of a light coming from somewhere behind him. Remember, it's nighttime, so it's totally dark where he is, and he's flying over a body of water, so he's kind of like in this void of darkness. And so any lights are really going to illuminate the cockpit. And so, he sees this light, he turns around, and maybe 3,000 or 4,000 feet behind him, he sees what looks like a plane that is the source of the light. And right away, Frederick's thinking. That is both surprising and also potentially very problematic, because he knew from his training that that was far too close to be to another plane. And so, the only explanation was either that pilot was off course, or Frederick was off course. And Frederick's thinking, if I'm off course here and I'm flying where I shouldn't be, I'm gonna get in trouble with their traffic control, and I might lose my pilot's license, like the one thing I covet, I might lose it. And so initially, Frederick really didn't know what to do. He was sort of panicking and just kind of frozen, like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do right now. And as this was happening, Frederick kept instinctively looking back at this light, trying to figure out what this plane was doing. And every time he would turn around, over the course of just a few seconds, it was very obvious that this light, this other plane, was gaining on him. And so Frederick starts to worry, like, this is not just about maybe getting in trouble or not. This plane might crash into me. Look how fast they're going, like, what do I do? I do. And so Frederick, at this point, he double-checked that he was on course, and based on his instruments and what he had been doing, he really felt like he was on course here all. And he just thinks, you know what? The best thing I can do here is just call air traffic control. So he grabs the radio and he gets a hold of Melbourne Air Traffic Control and he says, hey, there's this plane that is, like, right behind me. They're gaining on me. I'm worried they're gonna crash into me. Do I need to deviate? Like, what's going on here? And the air traffic controller very calmly says, okay, let me check the radar. Let me check the schedules. And so, Frederick, the whole time he's waiting for a response, he's looking over his shoulder, and still this light is gaining on him. It's getting closer and closer. And then, finally, the controller gets back on the radio and they tell Frederick, there is no other aircraft anywhere near you. Like, there's nothing over the Bass Strait. You are completely alone. But Frederick couldn't believe this because by now the aircraft that was right behind him has gotten right behind his. It's basically right on his tail. And Frederick is now completely panicked and he's getting ready to try to explain. Like, no, wait a minute. Like, there's got to be a better explanation here. There's something right here. But at that very moment, it becomes very clear to Frederick that this is not some ordinary aircraft. Because it began doing something when it got right up behind his aircraft that no normal aircraft could do. This light suddenly began orbiting Frederick's aircraft. Frederick is traveling forward, and this ball of light is basically whipping around his aircraft as fast as can be. He can barely make it out. He's starting to panic. And at the same time, Frederick begins to hear the sound of his engines starting to fail. And there was no reason for it. His craft was fine when he took off, but now it's clearly sputtering and failing. And so, all Frederick could do in this totally intense, panicked moment was just grab the radio and begin talking to air traffic control about what he was seeing. The person Frederick actually spoke to on the ground in this moment was an air traffic controller in Melbourne named Steve Roby. And Frederick would come off to Steve like he was totally crazy and unhinged. And Steve would say that he couldn't really understand what he was talking about, but at some point, Frederick clearly began talking about some sort of craft orbiting his own, and that his engine was starting to fail, and he didn't know what was going to happen, and he couldn't make an emergency landing. He was over water. And then suddenly Steve remembers hearing this grinding, metallic sound come over the radio that basically washed out whatever Frederick was saying. And then it just goes deadly silent. And after that, Frederick disappeared. They searched the area where they knew he was before he disappeared, but they never found his plane. There was no sign of a crash. He never landed at King Island or went back to Melbourne. He was just gone. All they have is that final recording of him describing something orbiting him. Then this grinding, metallic sound, and then silence. And recently, that audio recording was made public. Now, before I actually play a clip from that audio, here is the official explanation for what happened to Frederick as he was flying over the Bass Strait. It was so dark, and there were no lights really anywhere. That at some point, because he's an inexperienced pilot, I suppose he flipped his plane upside down without realizing it, and the light that he was seeing was actually just a reflection off the water below of his own plane. And eventually, from flying upside down, his engine began to fail, and he crashed into the Bass Strait. However, not everybody believes this explanation because, 1, it seems sort of preposterous to imagine that Frederick would not have realized he had flipped the plane upside down and was flying for so long inverted, like, how could you not notice that? And 2, this would not be the first time that somebody reported unexplained phenomena over the Bass Strait. In fact, over the years leading up to this incident with Frederick, there had been so many reports of UFOs flying over the Bass Strait and also unexplained disappearances that they've dubbed the Bass Strait Triangle after the Bermuda Triangle. Basically, it's a part of the world where a disproportionate number of unexplained phenomena occur. And so, to this day, Frederick's disappearance remains a mystery. All we have is his final call for help. Tell the Sierra Juliet, what type of aircraft is it? I cannot confirm that it's for blocks away from landing right now. We see the person on the field. Okay, that was deleted from the press accounts for some reason. And it's 5. 4.5 now. 5,000. Delta Zero Juliet. And confirm you cannot identify the aircraft. Delta Zero Juliet, Roger all. Stand by. Can you describe the aircraft? Tell the Sierra Juliet, Roger. How large would the object be? That's a green light. And it's on the telly side. So it's on the other side. Tell the Sierra Juliet. Delta Sierra Juliet, confirm the air. Aircraft just vanished. Tell the Sierra Juliet, is the aircraft still with you? Hello? Yes. Delta Zero Juliet, Roger. What are your intentions? And they're following, and it's not an aircraft. Thank you so much for watching, so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in the early 2000s, a young woman named Rose drove up to this huge mansion in the Hollywood Hills in California. She came to a stop outside the fence, and she just sat there for a minute, feeling very nervous because what she was about to do was highly illegal. So, Rose was a musician, but she definitely had not made it yet. However, she was desperately trying to break into the industry, and so her big plan today was she was going to sneak into this mansion, which was home to arguably one of the most famous people on the planet, a big-time musician. And her plan was to give them a copy of her demo CD because she believed if they would just listen to just one song on there, they would be blown away by her talent, and they would help usher her into the industry, and her career would take off. Now, obviously, she knew this could go horribly wrong. And, the owner of this home could just as easily call the police and have her thrown in jail. But to her, it felt like the risk was worth it. And so, Rose got out of her car and she looked up this huge driveway that extended up this hill. And it reached this big gate that sort of blocked off the driveway about halfway up. And then the driveway beyond the gate continued up to the mansion. And from where she was standing, there really was nobody out on the property anywhere. It was totally quiet, just this massive mansion up on a hill. But in front of the gate, on her side of the gate, was clearly the gardener. And, at first she thought maybe, the gardener was going to be a problem. That, of course, they would see her if she tried to break into the property. But, Rose was desperate and she thought the gardener looked friendly enough. And so she decided she would go up and maybe try to convince the gardener to let her go through the gate. And so she took a deep breath, and with her MOCD in hand, Rose began walking up this first stretch of driveway. And as she got closer to the gate, the gardener stopped what they were doing and turned to kind of see what this person was doing. And Rose was very young and charismatic, and she seemed friendly enough, and she comes walking up the driveway and she approaches the gardener, pulls out a $5 bill, and hands it to the gardener and just says, "Look, I got no money, like this is my last $5. Please, will you let me go through? I just want to drop something off." And so the gardener takes the $5 and just smiles at Rose and says, "Okay, go ahead." I mean, after all, Rose is like a kid. She seems completely harmless, What's the worst that could happen? And so Rose is kind of blown away that the gardener is actually letting this happen, but she doesn't wait. She just goes right past the gardener, slips through the front gate, and starts walking right up towards the mansion. And as Rose is walking up this driveway towards the front door of this gargantuan piece of property, She's looking around at the beautiful landscaping and just how valuable and beautiful everything looked. And she's seeing all these cameras pointing in every direction, and she's just waiting for any minute. Security guards to come running out here and tackle her to the ground. But nothing happened. She walked right up to this huge, beautiful front door, and again, no one's come to meet her. And so, she just knocks on the front door, but nobody comes to the door. So she's thinking, what do? I've come this far, I really want to hand this demo CD off. And so, almost like without even thinking, she just reached down and tried the doorknob, thinking, of course it's gonna be locked, but no, it was open. And so she turns the doorknob and pushes the door in, and now she's looking into the home of, again, one of the most famous people on the planet. And nobody's stopping her. At this point, Rose didn't even know what to make of the situation she found herself in. I mean, she had been fantasizing about how this was gonna go for weeks leading up to this, and it didn't involve it being this easy and straightforward. But here she was, and so again, without hesitation, she just walked inside this home. And as she's looking around, everything is beautiful and everything is clearly so expensive. There's all this amazing artwork and fancy furniture. There's billiard halls, there's wine cellars. This is a gorgeous property, exactly what you'd expect for the person who lives here. And as she's kind of snooping around the first floor looking for the owner, she's amazed to see that it's like nobody's home. It's just this vacant, unbelievable mansion. Eventually, she walks around and finds there's an elevator, and so she's like, all right, I'll just get in the elevator and go up. So she gets in this beautiful elevator, she shuts the door, she hits the button to go to the next floor. And as the car begins to move, she realizes, this is gonna make some noise. Someone's gonna hear me, oh my gosh, now I'm gonna get caught. And so she starts to freak out, and so she pulls out her big, clunky Nokia cell phone and she calls her mom. And when her mom picks up, she tells her that, you know what? Almost certainly I am about to get arrested here. And as her mom is like, what are you doing? What is going on here? The elevator that Rose is in came to a stop and the door opened up. And as soon as Rose saw what was in front of her, she just lowered the phone, her mom still talking into it, and just stared. It was like she was totally struck by what she was seeing, because right in front of her in the room, right outside of this elevator, is the person who owns this house, the extremely famous major celebrity who's just sitting there with a guitar, strumming along, just minding his own business. And he turns and looks at Rose, and Rose is looking at him, and there's this moment of just stunned silence, like neither of them can really figure out how this even came to be. Now at this point, Rose knew it was her chance. And so, even though she's unbelievably starstruck and scared and has no idea what's about to happen, she just quickly walks a little bit forward into the room and throws her MOCD onto this table that was sort of between the two of them. And this big-time musician is just, again, standing there staring at her, what are you doing here? And after Rose did that, she didn't say anything. She just turned back to the elevator and began to make her escape. But by the time she made it back to the front door, this big-time musician's security team did catch up to her, and they stopped her. However, they did decide not to call the police, and so Rose was very lucky that she escaped without a criminal record, which is sort of incredible when you consider the home she actually broke into. This was the home of Prince, again, arguably at the time, one of the most famous people in the world. It's bad enough sneaking into anybody's home, but this is, egregious. So the idea that she got right up next to Prince and gave him her MOCD without consequence, pretty incredible. But, despite all this, her interaction with Prince really didn't have any bearing on her career. He didn't care at all about her MOCD. He did not, throw her name out to industry contacts and, blow her career up, basically. He said, I won't press charges, now get out of here. That was it. However, Rose did go on to become an incredibly famous musician in her own right. She just did it without the help of Prince. Today, Rose's tracks go multi-platinum, and she sold more than 100 million copies of her records. Rose is actually her middle name. You very likely know her by her stage name, which is also her actual first name, and that is Kesha. Last year, we launched a brand new podcast here at Ballen Studios called Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke Layman. And so far, you guys have loved it. And in case you haven't heard, we also launched a YouTube channel for Redacted where you can not only listen to these episodes, but also watch the beautiful animations we've done for each of these episodes. That channel already has 150,000 subscribers, and it's growing really quickly, and there are hours of content available right now for you to binge. New uploads to this YouTube channel will be every single Tuesday. All you have to do is look up Redacted Mysteries on YouTube, and I'll also be putting a link in the description below. Wonder Plus subscribers can also watch Redacted on the Wonder app. Okay, back to the stories. One day in 2008, a 50-year-old man named Carlo was at his home in Connecticut, reviewing all this financial documentation. So, Carlo had filed for bankruptcy a few years earlier, and it had proven to be very complicated, and there was all this paperwork he was still getting. You know, his bankruptcy case had not even finalized yet. And so, what he thought would be sort of like a quick fix to a huge problem had turned into a really complicated mess. And now he had even more paperwork to sign. I mean, it was totally overwhelming. So Carlo was an actor, and in many ways, he had had lots of success. He had been on Broadway, he had starred in shows and movies. Like, he was a respected actor with lots of contacts in the industry. But, despite that, he hadn't really ever made it, like he couldn't really consistently land high-paying, or even consistent work period. And so, despite his reputation as being a very talented actor, it really wasn't translating to financial success. Now, this situation that Carlo was in would not have been that bad if he was single, but he wasn't. He was married with 4 children to take care of. And on top of that, Carlo also felt this really intense pressure that was sort of maybe felt in the industry in general, in the sort of entertainment industry, to keep up with his appearances. You know, as much as he was struggling financially, he felt like he didn't want his peers to know that might eat into his ability to get big roles. And so, he's got all this pressure to take care of his family, and all this pressure to maintain this idea that he's really successful and doing great. But in reality, he just felt like a total fraud. He had no money, and he felt like he didn't even know how he was going to dig himself out again. And so, as Carlo was sitting there staring at this mountain of paperwork, he started to have this very dark thought that had sort of crept into his mind a couple of times over the past few months. You know, as this huge issue just continued to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But now, this dark idea had become fully realized in his mind. He began to think, you know, maybe if I were to die, there could be a large insurance payout to my family that would solve their financial problems. And it would also sort of, you know, abscond me from looking like the fraud that I really am. Nobody would know. I'd be dead. They wouldn't know that I had all these issues. I'd just, you know, be gone, and people would miss me. And my family? They'd be financially taken care of, you know. Maybe that's a possibility. You know, obviously, Carlo was not trying to end his life because he didn't want to be here anymore. He just felt like he did not have another way out. And so, he actually went to his wife and began sort of, you know, nonchalantly asking her questions about various insurance plans to see if he had a good life insurance policy that would pay out if he were to go. And eventually, he got his wife to tell him that, yeah, you have a very generous life insurance policy. We are good if, the worst were to happen and something were to happen to you. And at that point, Carlo felt like, that's it. That's the way to fix this problem. I need to die. However, when Carlo actually did begin researching this route, seeing exactly how, an insurance payout would work if he were to take his own life, he quickly learned that, payouts after a suicide on these life insurance plans are very complicated, and there's all these stipulations involved. Because, insurance companies do not want people taking their own life in order to get these payouts. And so, Carlo was quickly seeing that if he were to take his life, it would not be like, okay, quick payout to his family. Quite the opposite. And in some cases, his family might not even be entitled to this payout. And so Carlo's thinking, well, okay, I can't take my own life. I need to find another way to have my life come to an end. And so he's thinking, okay, I'll start picking up really dangerous hobbies, and maybe I can sort of die by accident. Maybe I'll start hang gliding and fall out of my harness and that'll be the way I die, and maybe that'll lead to a payout. Or I'll start doing base jumping, or all these different things that might reasonably explain why he suddenly died. But he also was thinking, people would see through that. I'm not the type of guy that picks up really dangerous hobbies, and so that could be kind of suspiciousness. He's like, okay, well, what else could I do? And he's like, oh, I could hire a hitman. Somebody else will kill me, and then, that's not my fault. Somebody else took my life. That'll allow for a payout, right? But, the more he thought about it, the more that, too, seemed highly suspicious. I mean, people don't usually get away with hired hits. And so, several months go by, and Carlo is still alive because he's basically discovered that there really isn't a way to intentionally end his life, directly or indirectly, without getting caught in sort of jeopardizing the one thing he wants this to do, which is to have this payout for his family. And so he's just sort of stuck in this situation that he does not feel like he can get out of. Like, he's just completely buried by debt in this general financial crisis he's in. And so, Carlo was doing really the only thing he knew he could do, which is just to get out there and audition for as many shows and movies and various acting opportunities as he possibly could to at least, get some amount of money coming in, even though clearly it was still never going to be enough. But in late 2008, Carlo got an interesting call from his agent. His agent, who worked to get him some of these roles, now Carlo's agent, who did understand Carlo was in dire straits here, quickly explained to Carlo that, this role didn't really pay much, but, you'd be able to be a part of a very big show. I mean, yeah, your role is sort of minimal, but this is huge. It's a big credit, and, maybe it lends itself to you getting other work. This could be a great opportunity for you. Now, Carlo had heard his agent sort of pitch him on various roles in the opportunity and all that before, and so he was grateful to be, told this is a good opportunity, but he was sort of skeptical. But he received the script and he began reading about, what his character would be doing in the show, and he quickly realized that, this role actually might be more perfect for me than even the producers and directors might realize. So, this role was for this particular character on the show who sort of, in the show, hides in plain sight. Like, that's sort of the way they need to be portrayed. They're this huge, influential character in one way. But to the eye of the audience, they sort of look like a nobody-ins. They're sort of, again, hiding in plain sight. And Carlo, in his own life, very much felt like he was sort of hiding in plain sight to his peers in the industry. He's this acclaimed actor who's getting all these roles and everything. So great, he's a family man with 4 kids, but privately, he's living this hell. He's got all this financial debt. He's considered killing himself for an insurance payout to pay for his life. Like, he's living a completely double life here. And so he felt like, I know how to hide in plain sight. It's literally what I do every day. That's my actual life. And so he takes this role. And Carlo does such a world-class job portraying this character who hides in plain sight that the director and all these people who are working on the show, they're like, oh my goodness, Carlo is incredible. And this character that he's portraying, we gotta find a way to expand this character and make them more meaningful in the show. And so they quickly began, writing in additional scenes into this big-time show for Carlo's character. Again, not cause the character was so good, but because Carlo was so good at portraying that character. And as this character's role grew in the show itself began to succeed even more. The audience was like, wow, we love that character. And so the character only grew and became a staple in this show. And it ultimately completely changed Carlo's life, not only because this would be the opportunity that would make him massively famous and hugely successful, but also because he got paid and he was able to escape the financial hell that he was in through this incredible experience. Carlo would get paid millions and millions of dollars and would be nominated for multiple Emmy Awards. Now, you might know Carlo by his full name, which was Giancarlo Esposito, but if that name doesn't ring a bell, you very likely do know him from the life-changing role that he portrayed on the show. He was Gus Fring, the chicken shop kingpin from Breaking Bad. On Thursday, June 6, 2013, a 79-year-old woman named Marilyn Walpole, along with her husband Jim, walked down a busy street in Toronto, Canada. They were on their way back to their hotel after a dinner date at a local Irish pub called PJ O'Brien's. The couple was from Ohio, but they were on the last leg of a cross-country vacation through Canada. So far, the trip had been amazing, and so the retired couple is enjoying their evening, just walking down the road, reminiscing about what an amazing trip it had been. And at some point, as they're walking on the sidewalk, they see up ahead there's all this scaffolding that's been built up right over the sidewalk. There's some sort of construction happening on a building that lined the sidewalk, and there was a platform that was built maybe 8 to 10 feet above the sidewalk, this scaffolding, so that workers could stand on this platform and do construction. And so pedestrians like Marilyn and Jim, if they wanted to walk on the sidewalk, they would have to walk under the scaffolding. The sidewalk continues unobstructed right underneath. The scaffolding is intentionally built to allow for this tunnel for pedestrians to walk. This is not a big deal. It's very common in cities. And so Marilyn and Jim, they walk underneath the scaffolding, and they're not thinking anything of this. This is completely ordinary. There's other people also walking under the scaffolding. It's all good. But at some point, Jim trips while they're under the scaffolding. And where he lands is where there's a couple pieces of metal kind of poking up out of the ground. Some metal tubing, It was kind of obvious and people avoided it. But he's falling, he can't avoid it. And he lands with his neck striking, basically, this metal to poking up out of the ground. And so Jim, he hits the ground and the tube cuts his neck wide open. And so suddenly, Jim is literally gushing blood all over the sidewalk. And it happened so completely suddenly that Marilyn, she saw her husband trip, and she's kind of getting him to stand up, and as she's doing that, she's seeing all this blood pooling everywhere and she just freezes. She has no idea what's happened. What's going on with Jim? Why is he bleeding? And she starts screaming for help. And there are these two guys, there's nobody else inside the tunnel with them, but there are these two men who don't know each other. They're just strangers out on the street. They hear Marilyn screaming for help, pointing at her husband who's still laying on the ground, and these two guys come running over to her, and they're kind of assessing the situation, and they see Jim kind of grabbing at his neck. His blood is pouring out of him, and one of the men pulls out his phone and calls 911, so he starts talking to first responders. And the other man, he got down next to Jim. He pulled the scarf off from around his neck and he cradled Jim's head, and he wrapped the scarf around Jim's neck and he applied pressure to Jim's neck. And very calmly he told Jim, "It's okay. We're stopping the bleeding. Paramedics are on their way." He tells Marilyn, "It's okay. I've got your husband. You stay calm. Everything's gonna be fine." And so Marilyn, who again is just kind of in a panic here, this happened so suddenly, she immediately calmed down because she can tell clearly this second man, the guy holding her husband's head and applying pressure, he's got to be a doctor or at a minimum in the medical field, because this guy has just a commanding presence, a very calming presence, and knows what he's doing. And so, to Marilyn's great relief, the man on the ground holding her husband's head and the man who had called 911, they stayed with her and Jim all the way until the paramedics arrived, which was only a couple of minutes later. And then, after Jim was lifted up by paramedics and put into the back of the ambulance, Marilyn was told, "Hey, get in, you're coming with him." And as she's climbing into the ambulance, she turns and specifically asks the man who was kind of all over it, who was actually handling Jim and actually holding his head and applying pressure, she said, "What's your name?" And the man looked at her and he just said, "My name's John. Everything is fine. Your husband's gonna be okay. Now go okay." And so, Marilyn just felt so reassured by this guy, and she said, "Thank you so much." She hops in the ambulance, the door is shut, and they take off to the hospital. The following day, Marilyn was in her husband's hospital room, feeling very grateful that Jim was clearly going to survive her ride. So, ultimately, he had broken a finger and also needed 10 stitches to his neck to close the wound. But from what the doctors told them, basically, The cut to his neck had it been maybe an eighth of an inch deeper, it almost certainly would have severed his main artery, and then very likely he would have bled to death right there on the sidewalk before paramedics arrived. So, this was a very close call. But even without that deep of a penetration, the wound he sustained was still life-threatening, and the doctors told them that, because of the quick action of John and the other man who called 911. That very likely contributed to stabilizing him enough that he was able to get to the hospital and be saved. And so, Marilyn and Jim, they can't believe this has happened. But they're so grateful to the medical team and also to the two men from yesterday, who they don't even know who they are. But Marilyn is determined that she needs to find these two men, John and the other guy, and thank them. But she's realizing she really doesn't have a way to contact them. I mean, this all happened so quickly, and all she knows is one guy's named John. And she didn't even have the other guy's name. But luckily, the following day, when Marilyn and Jim were back at their hotel, they got a call from the front desk saying that they had a visitor. And it would turn out it was the man who had called 911. He had been really concerned about Jim and Marilyn and wanted to figure out if they were okay, and he had discovered where they were staying. And so, he had come to see them. And so, Marilyn and Jim, they come down, and they're so thankful. And they come to find out this guy is actually the owner of PJ O'Brien's pub, where they had gone to eat on the night Jim had fallen. And she's just saying, "Thank you so much. Without you, I don't know what would have happened." And then also Marilyn's like, do you know the other guy, John? The one who actually was applying pressure to Jim's neck? Because he also played a huge role in saving Jim's life. And the owner of the pub, he sort of looked back at Marilyn with a smile on his face, and he's like, "Well, I don't know him personally. We just happened to be walking down the street when you called out for help. But, I know who John is. Lots of people know who John is. In fact, honestly, you probably know who John is. Because it would turn out John was not a doctor, the way Marilyn assumed he was based on how easily he stepped into the fray of this medical crisis and knew what to do and put pressure on Jim's neck and seemed so calm. None of that had to do with medical training. He was not medically trained. Instead, John has a skill. He's this really charismatic, really commanding presence where every time he's in a room, people just look to him and think, oh, he's got to be in charge because he's just got this way about him, this X factor, and he carries that X factor on screen. Every role this guy plays in movies and TV shows, he is the leader, he is in charge. And it's so effortless, cause that's kind of his thing. And so, from that day forward, Marilyn and Jim had a brand new favorite actor, John Malkovich, the multi-time award-winning actor who literally saved Jim's life. Thank you so much for watching.